Hello, my name is Rebecca Place. I work at the British Council Bilbao, and I'm here today to talk about science projects in bilingual education. So I can also see myself being transcribed, which is very strange, so I've taken that away. So no transcription for me, right? So, as I said, my name is Rebecca Place, and I teach training. I've taught students from the age of 2 to the age of 72. And one of the things that I'm very interested in is bilingual education and everything that involves. So I'm going to be talking today about looking at projects, working with projects in class. And my first slide here has got some acronyms about that are involved in this kind of teaching. There's things that teachers might know about rather than students. We've got PBL twice, HOTS and LOTS, BICS and CALP, CLIL and KWL. So these elements will be explained as we go through the talk. Maybe you already know what they are, maybe you know already, and maybe you use them in your classes. But these are some of the ingredients, some of the elements that I think are quite important as we talk about projects in bilingual education. So let's start away with one of these speech bubbles, CLIL. So CLIL, as we can see here, it's a kind of puzzle, and I'm sure that you've come across this expression, this CLIL, but it's not really a methodology per se. Here in the centre, it says, as we can see here, a dual-focused teaching and learning approach. And I like to think that actually it's an umbrella term for things that work well in our classes. So whether or not you might not take CLIL as part of your methodology in your bilingual teaching, it probably the elements that make good teaching are here behind my umbrella. So I'm going to go back one slide and show us just a few of them. So for example, reflecting on learning. If we ask our students to think about the way they're progressing, the sorts of things they're learning, the way they're learning it, and what would make that learning better, then this is one of the elements of good teaching. If we're thinking about how we are teachers, the sorts of things that we do in our class, the kinds of examples that we give, the way that we monitor, the way that we assess, the way that we discuss with our students, but the way that we think about what we've been doing in our class, that's also a very important element. Taking time to make learning meaningful. So thinking about, okay, we have this amount of content that we need to get through by the end of the school year. But what of that content can I break away and just think about this question, this project, this subject? What is more meaningful for my learners? So how can I actually work with the time I have and decide which bits to concentrate on? Another of these elements, making learning visible, making our students aware of what's going on in their classes and how they have a part to play in this learning. Thinking about critical thinking, thinking about learner autonomy, connecting language with learning, scaffolding the content, scaffolding the kind of language that we're asking our students to use in order to demonstrate that they've understood the concept. So, as I said, an umbrella term, it's not a methodology, but it is a group of elements which work in class, which make our students work, which challenge our students, which challenge us as teachers, and which we hope will, as a whole, taken as a whole, will work towards a very positive outcome for our learners. So let's look at one way of designing a project-based activity or a project-based curriculum where the activities are selected and developed. We're brainstorming, we're selecting our objectives, we're deciding on a topic, we're choosing a sequence for our activities, implementing them and revising them, and then working back to the beginning again. Now I say we, but when I say we here in this context, in this project-based context, then that we is not simply the teacher. That we is the class as a whole, the students and the teacher, because one of the very important elements of project-based learning is that the students are in the centre, that they are in the driving seat, that the selection of activities, the brainstorming, selecting themes, objectives, activities, revision is led by the students. We are there to help them. We are there to guide them. So here's another structure that we could take as, okay, this is project-based learning, a structure for our planning. And you can see it's very, very similar, that we have the topic, the problem that we want to answer, and the project that we have as our final task. And of course, within that project, we have a sequence of activities. We have to think about the language that the students are going to need to use in order to build their final task. And we need to think about how we can assess their development as well, and the sorts of objectives that we have as the teacher. But these concepts, procedures and attitudes are vital parts of our project. And here we have the 7 essential elements, which are, again, are part of our project-based learning. We have our goals in the centre there, the knowledge. They need to understand, they need to be successful, and they need to work on different skills. And then if we start at 11 o'clock, we have our problem, our question, our challenge for our students. As I say, that's something that they have been a part of since the very beginning, the outset of the project. The inquiry, we need to have something that will motivate our students to continue to be interested in and to work through. And we can give, or we can suggest, we can support their different investigations into authentic knowledge, authentic questions. We don't want to present our question for our project as something that we know the answer to. We need it to be something where there will be real learning involved, and it will be learning about the concept, and at the same time it will be learning about the way that the students can learn better and work together better. And then it will also be a way of learning more language in our bilingual situation, where that language will help them discover more information and work towards the answer to their problem. So a very important element in every project-based learning project is that the students have voice and choice, that they are the ones who are taking control of the activities, that they are the ones who are taking the real choices, that maybe we can help them, but as they mature and as they work through secondary, then the teacher needs to be confident enough to take a back seat and say, well, this is where we're going, how do we get there? What are the tools that we need to get there? What are the steps that we need to get there? And the students need to be autonomous enough to be able to lead the way and work towards their final project, their final task. And they need to reflect about that, and they need to be critical, and they need to review it. And we need to be critical as well, and we need to review it, and we need to have, for example, a rubric in place which will tell us, are we working in the right direction? A rubric for the students that will tell them, how are they doing? Are they getting there? Are they working in a way which is not simply cyclical, but they're actually getting more knowledge as they develop? And then at the end of the project, then they have a product that they can show to the public. And in that public product, they will also have to develop their speaking skills and their listening skills and their presentation skills, all sorts of skills which are very important. So a project, we know that we're going to have various different elements to it. We know that it'll be something that we want our students to work together to attain. And how's it going to work in our actual teaching schedule? Is it something that we're just going to leave for Friday afternoon, for the end of term, for when we finish the exams in the summer? Or is it something that we want to bring into our teaching throughout the year, bring into the teaching throughout the school? Well, here's a question that is quite often answered in this way, that really doing project-based learning is the main course. It's not the dessert, okay? It's something that's important. It's something that is, it has enough weight behind it that you can dedicate your whole teaching structure to projects, because they will develop the students in many different ways, as we'll see in a second. By the way, every single one of the links that I've put here, I've put at the end of my PowerPoint, so you can see them all there at the end. So project-based learning, what should it be? Well, it should be student-led. It should have the students doing things, making things. There should be kinetic activity. There should be cutting and sticking. There should be producing, and not simply passive listening, being told and regurgitating for the exam at the end of it. They're actually, you want them to be able to produce something, and not something necessarily just on a paper. A project or a problem-based learning, there may not be one right answer. In fact, it's much better if there isn't just one right answer. Think about the idea behind science. There is rarely one correct answer, and when we've got an answer, well, maybe we continue to think about it and we come up with another answer or another question that's related to it. So these are the good beginnings of projects, or the beginnings of problem-based learning, or another PBL, which could be phenomenon-based learning as well, where we're discovering new parts of the world of science, and one discovery leads to another. The idea of the project should be student-led, but of course all our students are different, and these differences within our groups means that they have different ways of looking at the world, different previous knowledge, different ways of studying, different abilities when they're making something as well, so they can help each other. And that's a very important part of this idea of group work. And that group work will also be, sometimes they'll be working by themselves, sometimes they'll be working with their peers. They need to be mature enough to regulate, to work together, and to make the most of the time that they have working together. So that they need maturity as well. They need to learn how to learn together. And obviously, if we have heterogeneous groups where everybody comes to the project from a different starting place, this may be as well the level of English, how fluent they are in using the present simple, the past simple, in using conditionals. But we're not beginning our project thinking about the language. That will come into it. But of course, every student has a different starting point, and that is perfectly okay for the project, because we're asking them all sorts of different questions as well, not simply how much English do you know in order to be able to do this project. It's more about the science than the English. So what can project-based learning do? Well, it can go across the board. What happens in your classroom, and what happens in the history classroom, and what happens in the geography classroom, and what happens in the English classroom, across the board. That's the nice thing about projects. That, as I said, we can ask students to work individually, to work in pairs, in small groups, in larger groups, half class, whole class, 2 classes together, the whole school. So they're interacting in different ways, but of course the teacher is only part of that interaction pattern. It's not teacher-centred, it's student-centred. And where would we be today if we weren't using ICT? So we can use as much help as possible from resources, from devices, from Wikipedia, from everything. Okay, so we're taking advantage of all of the tools that we have at our disposal. That's the nice thing about project-based learning. And what does it need? Well, it needs for your school to be behind you if you're going to use projects. It needs the other teachers in your school, your colleagues, it needs the families of your students to appreciate what it is you're doing and how you're using a different way of approaching learning, a different way of assessing learning, a different way of bringing language and content together in your bilingual class. And obviously, you're not going to be, as I've said, you're not going to be the person who is the font of all knowledge in the classroom anymore. You're now the helper, the facilitator, you're the monitor, you're the guide, you're the scaffolding, but you're not the person who knows the answer, because we don't know the answer yet. We have to work our way towards it, and you're part of that group, but you're not leading it. And of course, you do need time. You need time before you start your project, while you're working on your project, at the end of your project, to make sure that the students know what they are going to do. They can see where they're going. They can see what they've done, and you're coordinating with them, but time also to coordinate with your peers, your colleagues in school, maybe with colleagues from a different school who are also working on project work. You don't need to spend hours and hours and hours preparing things. You can share it with your colleagues, you can share it with the students, but it is necessary to coordinate and to have time to decide what you're going to be focusing on and what you're not going to be focusing on. And then finally, some last positive aspects of project-based learning, the kinds of things that it will develop in your students, the sorts of things that it will increase. If a student has actually taken part in learning actively, then they will remember more about it. And then the skills that they learn in your project work, they can transfer to different situations, to different classes, inside and outside school, personal and academic. They can develop their skills with listening and speaking to one another and giving their presentations, so they can find out more information. It'll help them do that and also present their findings. So here we have the elements, and here we have, for example, the classroom dynamics of our project. 3 is a nice number. 3 is not too small, not too big. So we have 3 thinking heads, and it's always nice as well to give your students a role. Then you do another project and they swap around their roles, and you have the secretary who at this point in this project will be the person who takes notes. So they're the ones with the paper and pen, they're the ones with the tablet, they're the ones who will write up the findings. You have the spokesperson who will present your findings, and you have Friday. I don't know if you've ever come across Friday, okay? It's sometimes called Girl Friday, Boy Friday. Originally it was Man Friday from the story Robinson Crusoe. So if you remember the story of Robinson Crusoe, yes, the shipwrecked sailor who set up life on a desert island. Well, he was helped quite a lot by Man Friday, a native who fished and built a house and found water, etc., etc. So Friday in your group is the person who helps, goes and gets things, goes and finds a bit of information, shares, goes and asks for information from another group to share, gets a stapler, gets another iPad, etc., etc. So you've got people who have different roles, sometimes more academic, sometimes more active. Sometimes it's a skill of speaking, writing, or interpersonal development. But of course, you're giving your students, this is what they're going to be doing. Okay, I'll give you that role. Now, develop your role for yourself. So that would be our classroom dynamics. And let's think about then what kind of activities we might be doing. Well, imagine that we have in the school grounds, in the school gardens, there's a pond or a puddle or a lake. And on that puddle, in early summer, we get some of these insects. And so we go out and we have a look at it. We discover what this insect is. Now, it just so happens that that insect also appears in our textbook. So this is an image and then a text in a moment that comes from the textbook by Macmillan about science, biology in ESO. And it's talking about the life of a damselfly. A damselfly that we know what it is because we've seen it. We're interested. We're going to have a look. We're investigating. We've discovered what it is. We've had a look at the visual here with its eggs, and then we have, okay, how do we pronounce that? So we're thinking about the pronunciation as well of nymph and the spelling, very important. And so here's our life cycle. And then we can go further into the life cycle and we can see if anybody knows anything about damselflies or dragonflies, for example. That would be our KWL, our previous knowledge, what they know already. And then what do you want to know about it? Well, for example, the eggs. Where do they lay their eggs? What do the eggs look like? And then from that egg, then we know that it develops into a nymph. So maybe we want to know something more about the life cycle. And so here's a little activity. I don't know if you've ever done dictations with your students. Dictations, that's not very communicative. Oh, well, here's a way of doing a dictation which is highly communicative. And if you think about the time that you spend doing this dictation, okay, we're working with a short text, which I will read in a moment. And probably we're spending more time with this text than we would do if this were a teacher-led activity where I say, okay, turn to page 32. Now we're going to look at the life cycle of a damselfly. And this is the image and blah, 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 blah. Some students take notes, some students draw on the table, some students look out of the window, and basically I'm just telling them what's in their book anyway. What's the point? What's gone in? What have they really learned from that? So we could do it a different way, and it could be me as the teacher, or it could be one of the students who's prepared this previously and done a little bit of research and found on internet a little bit of more information about the life cycle of a damselfly and how their eggs come to be. And so, for example, student A, who has found this information, has practiced reading it aloud. They've looked at the pronunciation of the difficult words and they read it to their peers. For example, females can lay hundreds of eggs during their adult lives in batches over a few days or even weeks. Their endophytic eggs are elongated in shape and are laid into plant material. Damselflies have scythe-like oviposters and inject their eggs into plant stems or leaves, rotten wood or mud on or close to the surface of the water. So we've looked at a real damselfly. We've looked at an image, we've discussed it, we've shared what we know about it. Then we have an introduction to this text. Now, in a traditional dictation, we would never read it so fast, and we might chop it up into little sense chunks, but probably the meaning of the whole text won't be as clear because it's been divided up as a language activity. But we're interested in the content of this activity, in the content of this text. So then the reader, the teacher, student A, reads the text again at the same pace, the pace which makes it easy to understand. It's the kind of pace that we might be listening to if we're listening to the voiceover of a video. And while the reader reads it for the second time, the students take notes. They take notes. They're not trying to write everything. And if I'm going to read it at the same pace, nobody, not even super person, is going to be able to write as fast as that. So most probably they'll only write, well, what? Again, you can elicit from the students. What is it you're going to be writing down? Well, probably the important bits. And those important bits are, well, they're probably going to be nouns and maybe verbs and possibly adjectives. And are you going to write down articles or auxiliary verbs? No, probably not. Okay, so the text is read again, and the students have a limited time. They know what it's about. They know what's going to be the idea, the context of it. Okay, so they take some notes, and then they share those notes in their group. The secretary, the spokesperson, and Friday share what they have. They share what they have. Oh, I've got this one. Oh, okay. Well, and then little by little, they're building up the text. Then the text is read for a third and final time, and any holes are filled. And the goal of this activity is to build a text which means the right thing, which has a flavour of the original, with as much as possible the academic language, batches, endophytic, elongated, scythe-like, that were present in the original, but the students have been thinking about it. As they reconstructed that text, they were really thinking about the meaning behind the text. So one way of working with a text where we have some information, for example, in the textbook, and then, as David Attenborough said, if they experience it, it'll come to mean something. So he was talking about protecting wildlife, and I'm talking about learning about wildlife. But if your students have experienced something, they've worked on a text, then they're going to be that much closer to being able to reproduce in their own words with understanding than if they are simply told the information and asked to regurgitate it for their exam. Thinking about the kind of information that we're giving to the students and asking from them, then maybe we can see that there's a triple dimension to language, a triple dimension to the focus in our classes, because we have on one side the concept, the idea, for example, about the way that a damselfly lays its eggs. Then we're thinking about the procedure. Well, in this case, we were thinking about a dictogloss. Now, if it's the first time we've ever done that kind of activity, maybe the concepts have to be things that we've worked on before. And maybe the language that we're asking the students to listen to and reproduce has to be easy. Because what we need to do here is like working with a mixing table. If one of our elements is complex, then the other two have to be less so. If the language that we're asking the students to produce is going to be complex language, then we need to work on a concept that they're already familiar with, and with a procedure, an activity that we don't need to spend a long time explaining. We need to use something that they've already worked with before. So you can play with these three, and as the concepts get more complex, then use procedures that they've used before. Get them to use language which is simple, and then we can up the language later on. So this is Phil Ball, who coined the phrase of this mixing desk. And he says, for example, okay, so the concept is the science. The procedure is the skills that we're going to be using, interpreting, transcribing, producing descriptions. And the specific language is what we're going to be using for the to describe the content, the adjectives, the comparatives, superlatives, etc. So these are the three elements that we need to play with. Now, if we're thinking about these three elements, and maybe we think, all right, well, how do I assess? How do I make sure that my students are taking this on board? So I'm going to assess them. But when I'm talking about assessing a project, what do I need to bear in mind? Why am I doing it? Why am I assessing them? Is it to find out if they have learned things? Is it to find out where I need to or guide them towards so that they can learn some more about the subject? Is it to see if they're progressing well and then their different skills are developing? Or is it for them to, okay, think about how they're doing so that they can see where they need to work on with their content or with language? Or is it basically I need to assess them because my colleagues, their parents, the head of the school, the education department oblige me to assess my students, and then they need a qualification at the end of the course? Well, most probably it's a combination of everything, because we know that we don't live in a lovely bubble where we can just do project work and never actually give them a mark. Okay, so we need to think about that in a sensible way, but we also need to bear in mind these first elements of why do we assess? I think it's very important to find out what motivates our learners and what kind of support strategies they need in order to do better. So these are things that we need to bear in mind as well when we're thinking about assessing our learners. Because if we think about it, I love this, closed tests only teach answering closed tests. There are no closed tests in real life or working life. There are only real communication situations where information must be applied and messages must be transmitted comprehensively and understandably to another person. So think about that. When we're going to assess our students, why are we doing it? How are we doing it? How real is the situation? So some of the things that we can focus on when we're thinking about assessing, well, yes, we can assess the answer to a maths question. Is it correct? Fantastic, good. We can assess how well they've used a certain language area. We can assess whether they've used specific pieces of vocabulary or a specific tense. Excuse me, what a daddy long legs. It's not a damselfly, but it's flying around. But we can also use our assessment to see how well their communication skills, their cognitive skills, their practical skills are developing, and how far they have come in the process of learning to learn. So these are also important elements to bear in mind when we're designing assessment and we're thinking about how we evaluate our students. Here's an example of some questions where we're taking into consideration the three elements, the conceptual, the procedural, and the linguistic demands. For example, our first question here, which of these animals is likely to live in a desert? Tick the ones you think they are. Well, the concept, animals in a desert, a polar bear? Probably not. Okay, fairly simple. The procedure, read, tick, easy. The language, polar bear, dolphin, gerbil, simple as well. Okay, so we're working with very simple stuff. We could up the procedure and say, what do you think? Which animals do you think? Name 5 animals which live in a desert. We could up the concept and we could ask a question. We could decide, why do these animals not live in a desert? Why are these animals better suited to be living in a desert? We could use some more more demanding language, and we could ask them to talk about physiological differences between a dolphin and a camel. What is it about the camel biologically, scientifically, that makes it more suited to living in a desert than a polar bear? And get them to think about it and discuss it. So maybe you wouldn't show your students this box with high, mid, low, conceptual, procedural language demands, but it is something that is useful for the teacher to bear in mind when you're designing a test for your students. Here's another rubric that you can use when you're thinking about how am I going to assess my students. Here we have a rubric with the worst possible worst case scenario of a student who hasn't included any defining characteristics of a planet in the solar system, and then the student who will get the highest mark because they've included at least one defining characteristic and they've written their description. Okay, so we could use a rubric. Rubric is always very useful for the teacher, but also a rubric for the students, a rubric for them to decide, well, let's work on this together and let's think about what you need to put into your description, into your work, into your project, your final project, to demonstrate that you have learnt more content, that you have used more language, that you understand and that you can demonstrate your understanding. So working on rubrics with the students, designing them with the students, is also a very useful way of using some time in your class in order to make them conscious of how they can develop and how they can demonstrate what they've learned. So here, for example, some questions from this Macmillan textbook, where the students are asked, for example, question number 25. Here we've got the northern walking stick, a stick insect. It looks like a stick. It's camouflaged, so its predators can't find it. Find some information about it. Here's a question. What sort of physical adaptations have helped this insect to survive? And then look a little bit further. Find some more invertebrates who adapt so that they can survive. So we've got an initial question, an initial situation, and then the students are pushed, asked, challenged. Keep going, think about it, work with it. Maybe they're asked, like in question number 19, to find information to put into a table. But then there's another question. Do you think that a millipede and an earthworm are related? Think about it, discuss it, present your argument, listen to other people's arguments, weigh up the evidence. That's what science is all about. But of course, if we want our students to demonstrate in a very capable way that they can talk about, if we want them to talk about the answer to the problem or the answer to the project, then we need to give them language to do so. Because even if they've got a very high level of English, for example, in our bilingual classes, they need to be guided towards and supported while they use the academic language. Because in spite of the fact that in science, for example, we're looking at a lot of vocabulary which has a Latinate base or a Greek base, which will be similar to Spanish in many respects, unless that language has been overtly presented or overtly discovered in class by the teacher, by the students, guided discovery of it, then they won't be able to use a language which is fitting with scientific investigation. So here are some strategies that we can use from a teacher point of view and within the groups as well, where you're connecting to background knowledge. For example, your KWL. What did you know about this before we started? Using infographics, using graphs, using charts, using realia, using things in class, letting them use their first language. This is bilingual, it's not monolingual. We're asking the students to use what will help them in their makeup to work on the project, to get the answer to the questions. And things like modeling answers, giving physical mime, gestures, intonation, things that will help them, things that will give them more clues to understanding what the concept is, and then language elements like sentence starters or structures, which they can use to write a model and to prepare the information that they need to get over in their presentation or in the work towards their presentation in good English, for example. So here's a writer, Donald Lee Fields, who has written various books of material about scaffolding, and she also has this web page, and I want to show you a couple of little activities that she's suggested for secondary science classes. For example, using an information wheel. Very simple idea. It's like back in primary, where they cut out two circles, one with a space, and then you would find information. Or again, this could be student A, student X, student Z, who has just found some information about the project we're working on at the moment. So each group of 3, secretary, the spokesperson, and Friday, gets a part of the text that is around the class. Now, again, we're spending time on a text which, if we were going to stand in front of the class and give a lecture, we wouldn't spend so much time on it. But we want the students to understand it. We want the students to work with it and to really go deeply into the text, so that the language that's used in our model is something that they will then be able to use for themselves. So if you can see in this little image here, we've got the same text: concrete resists compression, blah, 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 blah. But it's got different gaps in it. So these 4 parts of this bit of text are cut up, stuck onto the wheel, and then a split pin put through the top of the blue part of the wheel, which covers them. So students together look at one part of the text and see if they can work out what the missing words would be. Then they turn the wheel and they have the same text with the words that they guessed or didn't, and then new gaps. So again, they're testing themselves, they're working with the text, they're thinking about the meaning of the text, and they're trying to recall the language that has been used, and or language that they could provide, which might be different to the original text, but would fit in the context. So they're working again and again and again with this text until they feel that they know the text, they understand the missing parts, and they can complete the text. And then they swap with another group and they work on another part of the text and another part. So they're building up their confidence. They're working with a reduced but well-written model, and they're building their language base and their concept base, and also their confidence base using English in this class. one of the speech bubbles that we had right at the beginning was HOTS and LOTS, which of course referred to Bloom. And here were the HOTS, the higher order thinking skills, creating, evaluating and analysing, and the lower order thinking skills, remembering, understanding, applying. So things that we need to encourage our students to use in our project-based work, in our problem-based work, is not only remembering, understanding, but also evaluating, creating. So going from the bottom right up to the top, thinking about different sorts of questions that you can use. And another example of an activity from Donna Summer's book on scaffolding is using, okay, a visual organizer, a graph. So here she's got a climate graph and some information about the temperatures and the rainfall over the year. And then she's asking the students, well, okay, use lower order thinking questions and higher order thinking questions. The easy to the more complex. The basic, okay, looking at this graph, write a question for another group which has a yes, no answer. Write a question which involves which, for example, which part of the graph indicates the months of the year. Nice and simple. But move on up through the climb up towards the higher order thinking questions. How? How was this data gathered? We can't tell from here. We have to think about it. We have to discuss. We have to share our ideas. Why? Why do people feel this information is important? Well, there's a good question. Let's think about it in a social, in a much wider situation, thinking outside the box. What if you were asked to gather rainfall and temperatures over a 1-year period? Where would you go? Why would you focus on that part of the world? How would you do it? Okay. So thinking from a science point of view, from a project point of view, and pushing students to think in a wider way, not forgetting the basic questions, because they're always very important. They need to remember, they need to understand, but they also need to expand the way they think and do that together in a controlled classroom, low stress atmosphere where they're playing with the language, they're playing with the concepts, but they're pushing the boundaries. So we had this activity where students were asked, for example, in my class, I might say, okay, well, here we've got 6 different concepts. What I want you to do is to move around the class and to ask your colleagues, to ask your friends, do you know what KWL is? Do you know what PBL stands for? And if you find somebody who does, then get them to tell you, write down their name, and then go and ask somebody else. So a very simple activity, a nice one for beginning a course, because you find out about each other. Find someone who has been to France in the last 6 months. Find someone who has never been skiing. Okay, those typical things. But then we can also use this way of getting students to talk to each other and getting students to learn from each other. Well, why don't we use the science that we're working on in class? For example, okay, the beginning of an introductory unit about geography, about Saudi Arabia. What do we know? Well, we've got 16 elements here, and the teacher has asked the students, walk around the class, talk to different people, and see if someone can tell you about the climate in Saudi Arabia, what the currency is in Saudi Arabia. And when they tell you, write down their answer and write down their name, and then go and talk to somebody else. Communicate, discuss, ask them questions in a very controlled way, and then you can share the things that you know too. So that's one way of doing it. And then, well, why not, if we're at the end of our class, we've been talking about cells, see if you can find somebody in the class who can label the cell wall. write it down, take their knowledge, share the knowledge, and also write down who it was, and then go and ask somebody else. And if you know something, you can share your knowledge with your peers. Can you explain the collision theory? Okay, don't tell me, but tell your peer. See if you can find somebody who can explain the effect of concentration on reaction rates. Okay, go and ask them. Share your ideas, share your knowledge, talk to each other, express the knowledge that you know in your own terms. Maybe it's the end of term and we're doing some revision. Why do revision individually? Why not do revision around the class where they share what they know? So getting students to be aware of the knowledge that they have and aware of the importance of collaborating and working with their peers. So all of this kind of work is based on what the students already know and then what they're learning little by little and how they can demonstrate that. So we had, right at the beginning, one of our bubbles was KWL, which was what I already know, what I want to know in this problem-based approach. And then at the end of our project, I can look back and I can say what I've learned. But this is slightly more elaborate, this chart, because we've also got how I find out, very important in our project. We need to think about connecting ideas. We need to think about basic literacy, about ICT, about using the media. And then we need to think about the actions I'm going to take. Okay, we've discovered something and now I need to communicate what I've discovered. I need to create something to share that knowledge. And then at the end of my project, that's not the end of my project. Think about the idea of science. When you've answered one question, it opens up another question. So the idea of the rolling knowledge, the rolling discovery from one project to another throughout their school curriculum. These were, I think, the last two unanswered bubbles, BICS and CALP. These are nomenclatures used in CLIL, for example, but very relevant in this case, because if we're talking about helping our students and giving them the right kind of language so that they can really demonstrate that not only have they understood, but they also have the English necessary to share what they've learned and to present their findings, then they don't only need BICS, they need CALP. Let's think about these kids and what they're talking about. Probably, well, maybe the two girls are talking about Justin Bieber, or they're talking about something that happened in the playground, or they're talking about the latest TikTok. They're using basic interpersonal communication skills. They're using everyday language, the kind of language that, yes, you can talk about insects and having eggs and putting the eggs near water. Okay, and we can get across our ideas. But if we want to talk about the damselfly and we want to talk about the specific elongated eggs and the scythe-like proboscis on their tail, etc., 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 then we need specific language. We need the kind of language that will show our listeners or our readers at the end of our presentation that we have the scientific knowledge and we're able to enunciate that. So the sort of academic language that these kids are probably using when they're discussing a problem on the board is the cognitive academic linguistic proficiency, which is horrendous, but it means specific language needed to be able to talk about that science in context, for example. Here's another example from the Macmillan textbook where we're given lots and lots of vocabulary that will come up in the unit, and they've made a word cloud of it. Now you can play with these by categorizing. Okay, categorizing invertebrates that live in water or on land or in the air. You can categorize it by invertebrates that you eat, that you don't eat. We can categorize it by invertebrates which have 1 syllable, 2 syllables, or 3 syllables. We can think about the pronunciation, whether that pronunciation is strong syllable, weak syllable, like a lobster, or if it's weak syllable, strong syllable. And I know there is one, but I can't think where it would be. Okay, or a single syllable, snails, or 3 syllables, like I know I had one when I wrote it down. Gastropod or arthropod, and see how the patterns of our pronunciation worked as well, because that's very important when we're going to tell somebody about what we've discovered. We need to have the wherewithal to tell them with confidence and for them to understand what we're talking about. Calcarean sponges, very important stuff. So we have the language, we have various different activities that we can use to encourage our students to think about the material, to be motivated to discover more material for themselves. But of course, all this will work best when we work with our class, with our group, because they come to our class with all sorts of different positive characteristics. For example, they might have a different first language, they have different personalities, they are shyer or less shy, they have had different experiences, cultural, cognitive skills. Each student is different and will develop in a different way. And of course, ooh, excuse me, why did I do that? Oh, yeah. Each student brings their aptitudes, their learning preferences, and their motivation into the class. And these are elements that we can truly work with and work on when we're focusing on project-based learning. There are other elements, for example, thinking routines. If we can demonstrate and we can introduce them to different visible thinking techniques, then we can help them puzzle out things. We can challenge them to extend and to connect ideas, and we can work with those ideas to develop further and to get them to develop further. So what they've been focusing on in their project really means something to them, to everybody in the group, in however they come to that project at the beginning, and whatever they put into the project individually, they learn something as well as a group. So here are finally the 6 steps that we need to take to work towards a project. We have our presentation of a project, of a problem. It might be a complete chaos, it might be open-ended, it might be fairly tricky to look at, but we're going to see if we can work with that. Here's our challenge. And then we decide how we're going to work on that problem, the definition of our problem, and the sorts of knowledge that we already have that will help us to tackle this problem, and the sorts of knowledge that we need in order to tackle this problem. And then what sort of solutions can we come up with? And then what sort of learning issues, from the student's point of view, from the teacher's point of view, the teacher as monitor, the teacher as facilitator, the students working in their groups, the students working individually, what kind of things will they need to be able to do? And then when they've found an answer, when they've found a solution, how are they going to share their findings? So, if you like, the 6 steps of their project, and then things that we need to bear in mind as teachers, as guides, as facilitators for these projects. A local problem, something that will have real meaning for your students, something that will motivate them because it actually makes sense to them in their lives, and not simply a list in a curriculum. And so these problems, the learning objectives, let the students be the ones who are in control, but obviously we can be there to help and to guide them. Maybe simply because we're adults and we have more experience, and so we can bring things to the class that maybe they don't have as yet. So the 6 steps and the things that as a teacher, as a guide, we need to bear in mind. But I think the most important thing probably comes on this last slide, just the difference between the traditional teacher-centered learning and the problem-based learning or the project-based learning, where the students are in the center, they have a problem, they identify what they need, they learn what they need, they apply that learning to solve the problem, and then they present it. And it's so much more active, so much more motivating, so much more worthwhile in a social, in a linguistic, in an academic way, that this is the sort of learning that we really need to bring into our classes. Thank you very much. My final slide is just some of the places that I've looked into when I was putting this together. So thank you very much for accompanying me. If you have any questions or any comments, please do send me an email. Here's my email there, Rebecca with 2 C's. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.